I was standing at the pharmacy counter on Commercial Street, the one I have been standing at every third Wednesday for 3 years, when a hand I did not recognize closed around my forearm with the certainty of someone who had practiced the gesture. I did not pull away. That is the detail I have returned to most since. Not the hand itself, but the fact that I did not resist it. 35 years of reading fog and tide charts and the distance between a ship's light and the rocks beneath it had taught me something about the difference between a threat and a warning. A threat grabs you to take something. A warning grabs you to leave something behind. This hand was leaving something behind. I am grateful you are here. Before we go further, tell me where you are watching from. Your city or your country. I read more than you might think. A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental, but the message behind it is something worth paying attention to as you keep listening. The pharmacy on Commercial Street is the kind of place that has not changed its floor tiles since 1986 and sees no reason to start. I know this because I have been counting those tiles, pale green with a dark grout line, every third Wednesday for 3 years, while I wait for the prescription that keeps my blood pressure in a range Dr. Vasquez considers acceptable. The pharmacist is a young woman named Caitlin who calls me Mr. Whitmore and means it the way young people mean formal names in small towns, not as distance but as a kind of affection that has not yet earned the right to drop the title. I am Harold Whitmore. Most people call me Hal. I am 73 years old. I spent 35 years as a lighthouse keeper's assistant and later a maritime preservation specialist at the Columbia River Maritime Museum, which is a formal way of saying I kept lights running and brass polished and records straight for most of my adult life. I retired 4 years ago because June made me promise I would. And June has been gone for 3 years now, which means I keep the promise for both of us. The way you keep a light burning after the ship it was meant for has already passed. The man's hand was dry and warm and closed around my left forearm 6 inches above the wrist, precisely where the cuff of my jacket ended and the skin began. He was shorter than I expected when I turned, though I had not been expecting anyone. So the expectation was constructed in the same moment. It was contradicted. Late 70s. A face that had spent decades in weather that came off water, hands that had done sustained physical work requiring precision rather than force, the kind of hands you develop repairing things that need to function correctly, in conditions that do not forgive error. He looked at me the way a man looks at a horizon he has been watching for a long time and has finally identified what he was watching for. Not surprise. Recognition. The expression of someone confirming a thing they already knew. He said, in a voice low enough that the pharmacy's overhead music nearly covered it. When your daughter brings you tea, do not drink it. Pour it into a glass jar and leave it overnight. Do you understand me? I did not understand him. I understood each word individually, the way you understand the individual notes of a foghorn before the pattern tells you which station is sounding. Daughter. Tea. Jar. Overnight. The words were clear. The composition was not. Before I could assemble a response, he pressed a sealed envelope into my right hand with the efficiency of someone passing a document they have been carrying for a long time and are ready to be finished carrying. The envelope was cream-colored and soft at the edges from handling. The kind of wear that comes from being kept in a coat pocket through multiple seasons. And on the front, in handwriting I would have recognized in a dark room by touch alone, was a single word. June. Not my name. My wife's name. Written in my wife's handwriting on an envelope I had never seen. Delivered by a man I had never met. In a pharmacy I had been standing in every third Wednesday for 3 years, without anything remarkable ever happening in it. He released my arm. He turned toward the door with a precision that did not belong to confusion or haste, but to a plan being executed on schedule. I called out. He did not stop. The automatic door opened and the October air came in carrying the smell of the Columbia River. Salt and mud and distance. And then he walked through it and into the fog on Commercial Street and was gone. I use that word deliberately. Gone. Not walked away. Not disappeared. Not any of the softer words people use when they mean someone left their field of vision. Gone the way a signal goes when the fog closes over the channel and the light you were tracking is simply no longer there. You know it still exists. You can no longer confirm it. Caitlin called my name from the counter. My prescription was ready. I picked it up with my left hand because my right hand was holding the envelope and had no intention of letting go. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I was not fine in the way the question usually means, but I was vertical and functioning, and that was the accurate answer to what she had actually asked. I walked out of the pharmacy into October. Commercial Street in Astoria. Oregon does not look the way most people imagine a coastal town. It looks like a place that was built for commerce and has been quietly adjusting its expectations ever since. The storefronts are old brick and painted wood. The fog comes off the Columbia River most mornings between September and April and settles into the streets with the patience of something that has no schedule and no opinion about yours. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the pharmacy and held the envelope at arm's length in the gray light and looked at June's handwriting and did not feel the cold, because there are things that override temperature, and the name of your dead wife in a stranger's hand on a Wednesday afternoon in October is one of them. A daughter, a tea, a jar, a night, and June's handwriting on an envelope that had been waiting inside someone's coat until the right Wednesday arrived. I stood on Commercial Street with the fog closing around me and the prescription in my left pocket and the envelope in my right hand, and I understood in the way a man understands a signal he has been trained to read, but has never received in person, that something had just changed, and the change had arrived in the exact manner. Important things arrive in Astoria, quietly, through the fog, without asking whether you were ready for it. I drove home the way the Columbia finds the ocean, without deciding to, because the route had been established long before the decision was required. Left on 14th Street, right on Franklin, up the hill past the old cannery building that has been a brew pub and a yoga studio and a brew pub again, and then the road narrows and the trees lean the direction the wind has been pushing them for 100 years, and at the end of it, the river appears. Not the river exactly. The place where the river stops being a river and starts being something else. The Columbia meets the Pacific at a wide gray mouth that has been swallowing ships since before anyone thought to put a lighthouse on the point, and June and I bought our house on the hill above it in 1991 because she said the view was the kind of thing that would keep a person honest. She was right about that. She was right about most things that required patience to evaluate. The house is a 2-story craftsman with cedar shingles that need replacing on the south side and a front porch I built myself the second summer we lived here. Douglas fir posts and a railing June designed on graph paper with the precision of a woman who had spent her career keeping records for the Clatsop County Assessor's Office. She measured everything twice. I cut everything once. Between the two of us, the porch came out level. I parked in the driveway and sat with the engine running and the envelope on the passenger seat. The fog had followed me up the hill. It does that in Astoria. It does not respect property lines or elevation or the desire of a man sitting in his truck to see clearly before he goes inside. The house was dark. It has been dark when I come home for 3 years now. Since the evening I walked through the front door and found it empty, in the particular way a house is empty when the person who made it full is not coming back. Not abandoned, simply unoccupied at the center. The way a lighthouse is unoccupied when the keeper has left, but the mechanism is still running. I went inside and did not turn on the hall light, because the hall light illuminates the coat hook where June's raincoat still hangs. And I had not yet decided what kind of evening this was. The kitchen smelled the way it smells in October. Wood smoke from the neighbors and the faint mineral undertone of river fog. I set the envelope on the kitchen table next to June's reading glasses, which I have not moved since the morning she set them down and forgot she owned them, which was 14 months before she forgot she owned the kitchen, which was 8 months before she forgot my name. Alzheimer's does not take a person all at once. It takes them in the order of what they love, starting with the small things and working inward. It took June's reading glasses first. Then, her recipes. Then the names of the flowers along the south fence. Then the route from bedroom to bathroom. Then my name. Then Nora's. Then her own. I did not watch all of it. That is the thing I carry. That has no bottom. I was at the museum keeping lights polished and records filed while my daughter watched her mother dissolve. And by the time I understood what I had done by not being there, the person I needed to apologize to could no longer recognize the man in her doorway. I sat at the kitchen table and told June about the man on Commercial Street. I told her the way I have told her things for 3 years, not as speech exactly, more as the release of pressure that builds during a day spent without the person who used to receive it. She answered the way she answers now, in the quality of the silence that fills the room when I say her name. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a list in June's careful assessor's script. The letters small and evenly spaced, the lines straight without a ruler, because June Whitmore did not require external tools to produce internal order. A list of our assets. The house on Franklin Avenue. Purchased 1991. Current. Assessed value. The truck, the savings account at Columbia Bank. The life insurance policy she had increased the year before her diagnosis without telling me. And then, separately, underlined twice in her preferred blue ink. The collection. 35 years of maritime artifacts accumulated across a career spent in lighthouses and preservation. Nautical charts from the 1870s. A brass sextant from a Columbia River bar pilot's kit. 2 ship's chronometers. 1 English, 1 American, both functioning. Navigation instruments, signal flags, a complete set of lighthouse service logbooks from Cape Disappointment dating to 1912. The room on the 2nd floor where I kept them had been June's idea. She designed the shelving, the way she designed the porch. On graph paper, measured twice. I had never assigned a dollar value to any of it. June had. The number at the bottom of the list was $640,000. Circled once. The second piece of paper was smaller. A note. The kind a person writes when they have something specific to say and are not certain how much time they have left to say it. It read, "A woman at Nora's grief group asks too many questions about the collection. She is not grieving. I am sure of this. I have watched her, the way I watch columns that do not add up. Give this to Hal when something feels wrong. He will know what to do. He reads fog the way I read numbers. Trust him to see it when the time comes." The date was 4 years ago. 14 months before she forgot her reading glasses. 22 months before she forgot my name. She had written it while she was still herself, while the disease had taken only the edges and not yet reached the center, and she had given it to someone I did not know, with instructions I was only now receiving, because something had felt wrong to a man whose name I did not yet have. June had known. She had known while she still had the capacity to know, and she had done the only thing a woman losing her memory could do with a warning she would not be able to deliver herself. She had written it down and given it to someone who would remember. She had sent it forward through time like a signal from a lighthouse that has already gone dark, aimed at a shore it can no longer see, trusting the light would reach the rocks before the ship did. I sat in the kitchen and looked at her handwriting, and understood that my wife had been protecting me from a place I could not reach. A woman at Nora's grief group. The collection. $640,000 in June's careful blue ink. I had not spoken to Nora about any grief group. I had not spoken to Nora about many things. That was mine to carry too. Nora arrived on Saturday, the way weather arrives on the Oregon coast. Announced by a change in pressure you can feel before you can name it. I was on the back porch when I heard the car pull into the driveway, and I stayed where I was for a moment. Because a man who has been reading atmospheric shifts for 35 years does not rush toward a change in conditions. He observes. First, he notes what direction the wind is coming from. Then he adjusts. The car was not Nora's. Nora drives a 12-year-old Subaru with a dent in the rear passenger door that she has never repaired, because she says it gives the car personality, which is the kind of thing a writer says about a thing that would cost money to fix. This car was a dark sedan, clean, recent model, parked with the precision of someone who thinks about where they put things. 2 doors opened. Nora came around the driver's side. She is 38 years old, my only child. A freelance writer living in Portland who publishes essays about grief and motherhood and the particular loneliness of coastal towns, which she writes about with an authority I have never questioned and a tenderness she has never once extended to me. She has dark hair, she keeps short and June's jawline and my height, and she kissed me on the cheek the way she has since she was a teenager, the brief press of someone executing a habit that serves as both greeting and boundary. The woman who came around the passenger side was someone I had not met. She was younger than Nora, late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back and the kind of face that arranges itself into warmth before you have said anything to deserve it. She wore a linen jacket in October, which told me she had dressed for an impression rather than the weather, and she carried a paper bag from a store I did not recognize and a small ceramic teapot wrapped in cloth. Nora said, "Dad, this is Bryn. From my group." Bryn Sayers extended her hand and said, "Mr. Whitmore, I have heard so much about you." She said it with the particular emphasis people place on words when they want the words to land in a specific way. And I noted that she squeezed my hand slightly longer than a first meeting typically warrants, the way someone does when they are establishing a connection they intend to build on. I said it was nice to meet her. I meant the words the way you mean words when you do not yet know what they are going to cost. They came inside. Bryn moved through my house with the attentiveness of someone entering a room for the first time, and wanting to appear as though they are not taking inventory. She complimented the porch. She complimented the kitchen tile. She stopped in the hallway and looked at the framed photograph of June and me at the Cape Disappointment lighthouse, taken the year before her diagnosis, and said, "She was beautiful." Not "she is beautiful," the way people say it when they are being generous about the dead. But she was beautiful, as if she had studied the photograph before arriving and already knew which tense to use. I noted that. I filed it where I file things I do not yet understand but suspect I will need later. Nora went to the kitchen and began unpacking the paper bag. Soup ingredients. I recognized the pattern before she finished setting them on the counter. Onion, celery, chicken stock, the dried thyme June bought only from the spice shop on Duane Street because she said the grocery store kind tasted like it had given up. Nora was making June's soup. She was making it from June's recipe, the one in the small blue notebook June kept in the kitchen drawer, the notebook I had not opened since she died but Nora apparently had, because the ingredients were exact. I did not ask when she had taken the notebook. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter cook her dead mother's recipe and said it smelled wonderful. And it did, and I did not know yet what it would cost me to have said that. Bryn set the ceramic teapot on the counter beside the stove. She said it was a grief blend. Herbs she had formulated herself, chamomile and valerian, and something she called ashwagandha that she described as an adaptogen, which is a word I have looked up since and remain unconvinced by. She said it helped with sleep. She said it helped with the kind of tiredness that grief produces. The tiredness that does not respond to rest because it is not produced by effort. I said thank you. I left the teapot where she placed it. We ate at the table. Bryn asked about my work at the museum, about retirement, about the house. She asked questions the way someone asks questions when they have prepared them in advance and know how to space them so they do not sound prepared. She was attentive in the manner of someone who has decided what attentive looks like and practiced the result until the practice became invisible. Then she asked about the collection. She framed it as curiosity. She said Nora had mentioned it, and she had always been fascinated by maritime history. She asked whether the charts were original. She asked about the chronometers. She stood up from the table to look through the doorway toward the staircase that leads to the second-floor room and said, "I would love to see them sometime." I said, "Perhaps next visit." She smiled and said, "Of course," and returned to her soup and did not mention it again, which was the part that stayed with me. The graceful withdrawal, the absence of insistence. People who are genuinely curious push a second time. People who are cataloging do not need to. They have already gotten what they came for. Nora did not look at me during most of the meal. She looked at Bryn, at the soup, at the window. Not avoidance exactly. The way a person does not look at something they are not yet ready to see clearly, or the way a daughter does not look at the father she has been quietly blaming for 4 years. I recognized it because I had been on the other side of it since June died. The side that knows it is being not looked at and cannot object because the reason for the not looking is earned. After they left, I stood in the kitchen and noticed that Bryn had washed every dish, wiped every surface, and left the counter cleaner than I had kept it in 3 years. The ceramic teapot sat beside the stove with a small card that read, "For restful nights, steep 5 minutes, 1 cup before bed." And I thought, as I have thought about very few people in my life, that is not how a guest leaves a kitchen. That is how an inspector leaves a room she intends to return to. The teapot was on the counter. June's note was in the locked cabinet upstairs. I stood between the two and did not yet know which one to trust. The woman who had just cleaned my kitchen, or the woman who had written me a warning from 4 years inside her own disappearing. A pattern is just a single occurrence repeated until the repetition becomes invisible. That is what makes patterns dangerous. Not their complexity, but their ordinariness. Bryn came on Tuesdays now. She came on Fridays. She arrived between 9 and 9:30 in the morning, carrying something that had been prepared in advance, and presented as though it had just occurred to her. The first Tuesday after the Saturday lunch, it was fresh juice, a green mixture she described in terms I did not retain, pressed that morning, organic, something about enzymes and absorption rates. She left it on the counter and said it would help with the fatigue that men my age carried without recognizing it. I drank it because she left it on the counter and I did not want to be ungracious. The Friday of the same week, she brought soup. Not June's recipe this time. Her own. Something involving bone broth and turmeric, and a word she used twice that I believe was anti-inflammatory. She heated it on my stove and served it in June's bowls, and I ate it standing at the counter, the way I have eaten most meals since June died. Upright, and looking at nothing particular. The second week, the supplements arrived. She set them on the counter with a brief explanation. Magnesium for muscle recovery. Melatonin for sleep regulation. Something in a brown bottle she called an adaptogenic tincture, which was the second time I had heard that word, and the second time it failed to assemble into meaning. She said they were completely safe. The way people say a thing when they want you to stop examining it. I took them. I took them from her hand and swallowed them with the juice she had left and went back to whatever the afternoon was. The third week, the tea changed. Not the ceramic teapot from the first visit, a new blend, darker, in a sealed paper packet with a handwritten label. She said she had adjusted the formulation. She said this one was stronger. She said it was specifically designed for the kind of grief that settled into the body rather than the mind, as though grief could be directed to a specific address and the right herb could be sent to meet it there. I was at that point consuming 6 substances in 3 weeks that I had not chosen, had not researched, and could not have named if asked to list them. I did not connect them to anything. I called it kindness. A reasonable man. A man who had spent 35 years reading conditions that could kill him if he misread them, stood in his own kitchen and called it kindness. I started looking forward to her visits. That is the part I am most ashamed of now. I want to be precise about that shame, because it is a named kind that deserves the right name. It was not the shame of being fooled. It was the shame of having been so hungry for a presence in this house that I walked toward it without looking at what I was walking on. The changes arrived the way fog arrives. Not all at once, but in a thickening. You do not notice until you realize you can no longer see the far shore. The first thing I lost was the afternoon. Not lost exactly, more that the hours between 2 and 5 began arriving already blurred, the way a log entry looks when the ink has smeared before it dried. I would stand at the kitchen window at 4:30 and not be certain whether I had been standing there for 5 minutes or 40. The second thing I lost was the log. I opened my logbook one evening. The book I have kept every night for 35 years, recording weather, tide, observations, the ordinary data of a day, lived in proximity to water, and found that the previous night's page was blank. I had not written in it. I had not remembered not writing in it. The page was empty in the way a channel is empty, when the signal has stopped transmitting and no one has noticed because the silence sounds the same as the static. A lighthouse keeper who stops logging has stopped keeping. I stared at that blank page for a long time. The third thing I lost was the steadiness of my hands. Not dramatically. Not the kind of tremor that announces itself across a room. A fine vibration at the tips of my fingers when I held a pen, a hesitation in the grip when I picked up a coffee mug, as though the connection between intention and execution had developed a slight delay that had not been there the month before. I told myself it was age. I told myself retirement did something to the body that took time to adjust to. I told myself the October damp off the river was worse this year. Bryn had begun timing her arrivals to coincide with Hector being outside. Hector Rivas, my neighbor for 22 years, a retired commercial fisherman who walks his property line every morning at 9:15 and checks his mailbox every afternoon at 2:30, with the regularity of a man whose body still runs on a working schedule, his mind retired from a decade ago. She stopped to talk to him on the way in, and stopped to talk to him on the way out. Both times. 3 weeks running. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that is not wrong yet. I filed it. She asked Hector whether I seemed forgetful. I found that out later. Ask yourself what kind of person asks that question about a man she has known for 3 weeks. The doctor's appointment arrived without my requesting it. Bryn mentioned it on a Friday, already leaving, already at the door, in the tone of someone reporting something that had already been decided. I scheduled a checkup with Dr. Vasquez for next Thursday. Just routine. Nothing to worry about. She said it the way a person places a stone on a path. Casually, precisely, knowing that the person walking behind them will step on it without looking down. I did not ask how she knew who my doctor was. It would not have been difficult for someone who knew what she was doing. I told myself it was thoughtful. It was thoughtful in the way that a net is thoughtful about the shape of what it intends to catch. By the third week, I was telling myself she was the best thing that had happened to Nora in years. I meant it. That is the part that keeps me up when I think about what she was doing while I was meaning it. I meant it completely. In the uncomplicated way of a man who wanted to believe his daughter had found someone kind. The log sat open on my desk that Thursday night. The page for Wednesday was blank again. 2 blank pages in 35 years, both in the same month, both since the tea changed. I looked at the empty page, and I looked at my hands, and I did not yet connect them because the fog was doing what fog does, thickening so gradually that you do not notice you have lost the shore until you reach for it, and it is not there. In the car crossing the Astoria-Megler Bridge, 4 miles above the Columbia, Bryn was talking, Nora was driving, and neither of those things was an accident. The bridge runs 4.1 miles from Astoria to Point Elise on the Washington side, the longest continuous truss bridge in North America, and from its highest point, the river below looks less like water and more like a decision the landscape made a long time ago and has been living with ever since. The steel lattice of the truss throws shadows across the roadway in a rhythm that makes the light inside a moving car pulse like a slow heartbeat. Nora's hands were at 10 and 2. Her eyes were on the road. Bryn was in the passenger seat with her phone in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment in a conversation, the way you wait for a gap in traffic. She said, "He is slipping faster than I expected." Nora did not respond immediately. The bridge hum filled the car, the sound of tires on expansion joints, regular as breathing. Bryn said, "The collection needs to be cataloged and appraised before he loses track of what is in it. If he signs the power of attorney now, we can protect all of it. The house, the collection, the accounts, everything your mother built." Nora's grip adjusted on the wheel, a 1/4 inch tighter, the movement of someone absorbing something they are not yet ready to speak about. "Are you sure this is the right thing?" Nora said. Bryn reached across and placed her hand over Nora's on the steering wheel. Not a squeeze. The way you place something down on a surface to keep it from moving. We are protecting him from himself, Bryn said. Her voice had the particular warmth of someone who has learned how warmth sounds and can produce it without the underlying temperature. Isn't that what you wish someone had done for your mother? The car crossed the midpoint of the bridge. The river was 400 feet below. The fog sat on the water in long gray bands that moved with the current but never lifted. Nora did not answer. She did not need to. The question was not a question. It was a key turned in a lock that Bryn had been fitting for months, the lock of a daughter who had spent 4 years watching her mother dissolve while her father polished brass at the Maritime Museum and came home to a woman who no longer knew his name and said things like, "I will do better," without ever specifying when better was scheduled to begin. Bryn had found that lock the first week. She had been fitting the key ever since. And the specific question about June, about protecting someone from the person who should have protected them, was the turn. In the back seat was a paper bag containing loose-leaf tea. A new blend, the one she had described to Nora as stronger. Beside it was a folder containing a power of attorney document, pre-filled, awaiting a single signature on a line that had been left blank the way a trap is left open. The bridge ended. Washington became Oregon again. Nora drove in silence toward Astoria, and Bryn looked out the window at the fog on the water, and the expression on her face was not warmth. It was the expression of a woman watching a schedule proceed on time. I did not know any of this. I want to be clear about that. I did not know any of this because I was sitting on my back porch 3 miles away with a cold cup of coffee and a view of the Columbia that I had been looking at without seeing for 35 minutes. The river was doing what the river does in late October, running wide and flat and gray, carrying whatever the interior had given it toward a mouth it would reach whether I watched or not. The fog sat on the water the way it sits on everything in this town, patient and thorough and unconcerned with being wanted. I was thinking about Nora. I was thinking she seemed better lately. More present. More willing to come to the house. More willing to sit at the table and eat a meal without the particular silence that had filled every room she and I had occupied together since June's funeral. I attributed the change to Bryn. I was thinking, she is good for my daughter. She is the first person since June who has made Nora want to come home. I was thinking this while the metallic taste at the back of my throat did what it had been doing every afternoon for a week, sitting there like a word I could not quite pronounce, familiar and wrong at the same time. I did not connect the taste to the tea. I did not connect the blurred afternoons to the supplements. I did not connect the tremor in my hands to anything except age and retirement and the particular erosion that living alone performs on a body that was built to be in proximity to another. I told June about the taste. I told her the way I told her everything now. Facing the river, speaking into the fog, trusting that the message reached her. Even though I could not confirm delivery, she answered the way she answered. In the quality of the silence that followed, a silence that had a shape to it. A shape that this evening felt more like a warning than an answer. A fog does not lift because you want it to, Hal, she said once, in the real voice. The one I can still hear if the evening is quiet enough and the river is doing the right thing with the light. She said it the October before the diagnosis, standing at this same railing with her hands flat on the wood. It lifts when the conditions change. I had not understood what she meant then. I was beginning to understand it now, though I did not yet know what the conditions were or who was controlling them. On my back porch, I was thinking Bryn Sayers was the best thing that had happened to my daughter in years. In the car crossing back into Astoria, Bryn was calculating the depreciation rate of my mind against the timeline she had set for the signature she needed. Both things were true at the same time, and only one of them was a lie. The fog sat on the river and did not move, and I drank the last of the cold coffee and went inside to the kitchen where the tea was waiting on the counter where she had left it, and I made a cup without thinking about it. That is the part. Without thinking about it. A man who had spent 35 years thinking about everything he put his hands on, who had read tide charts and fog patterns and signal intervals with the precision of someone who understood that carelessness at a lighthouse was not a personal failing but a public danger, stood in his own kitchen and drank something without thinking about it, because a woman he had known for 3 weeks had placed it on his counter, and smiled. I drank it and went to bed, and slept the deep, dark sleep that had become ordinary, and did not dream of anything I could name. She arrived on a Friday with a document I had never asked for, in a folder I had never seen, carrying the weight of something that had already been decided before she walked through my door. Nora came alone. That was the first thing I noticed. No Bryn, no paper bag of supplements, no ceramic teapot, just my daughter. Her coat still on, her car keys still in her hand, the way a person holds keys when they have not yet committed to staying. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, and I saw something in her face I had not seen in the 4 years since June's funeral, a kind of nervous precision, the expression of someone performing a task they have rehearsed but do not fully own. She said, "I brought something I think we should talk about." She set the folder on the kitchen table. Blue. Standard legal size. The kind you buy at an office supply store when you want something to look official without being official. Inside was a document. 7 pages. Printed on the kind of paper that means a lawyer has been involved. And at the top of the first page in bold type, it said, "Durable power of attorney." I did not pick it up immediately. I have learned, across 35 years of reading instruments and conditions, that the interval between seeing something and touching it is where the most useful information lives. The way a person presents a document tells you as much as the document itself. Nora sat down across from me. She placed her hands flat on the table, the way June used to place her hands flat when she was about to deliver information she had organized in advance. The gesture was June's. The context was not. "It is just a precaution," she said. "For your protection. Bryn helped me understand that at your age, with the house and the collection and the accounts, it makes sense to have someone authorized to manage things if anything happens. It does not change anything. It just means someone can step in if you need help." I noticed the word someone. Not I. Not your daughter. Someone. A word chosen to sound general, while meaning specific. I pulled the document toward me and read it the way I read anything that mattered. Slowly, from the first word of the first page. My name in the principal line. Nora's name in the agent line. Broad authority over financial accounts, real property, personal property, and a phrase I read twice. Tangible assets, including but not limited to collections, artifacts, and items of historical or monetary value. The collection had its own clause. Someone had made sure of that. I looked up. Nora was watching my hands the way a person watches something they need to happen. Not my face. My hands. And the pen she had placed beside the folder, a black ballpoint, uncapped, positioned with the point toward me at the angle. A right-handed person would naturally pick it up. She had thought about the angle of the pen. That detail has stayed with me since. I picked it up. I held it over the signature line on page 7, and I felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight. A ballpoint pen weighs nothing, but the weight of what the pen was pointed at. The line was empty. Empty in the way a net is empty before it closes. I held the pen the way you hold a match over a fuse, understanding for the first time what signing would set on fire. And then, from somewhere below the surface of the fog that had been sitting on my thinking for 3 weeks, 2 things rose at the same time. The first was June's handwriting on a note I had read in this kitchen 3 weeks ago. A woman at Nora's grief group asks too many questions about the collection. She is not grieving. The second was a voice on a frozen sidewalk outside a pharmacy on Commercial Street, low and precise beneath the traffic. When your daughter brings you tea, do not drink it. I set the pen down, not dramatically, not with the force of a decision being announced. I set it down the way you set down a tool you have decided not to use. Gently, with the respect a man gives to something that could have done damage and did not. I need to think about it, I said, Something moved across Nora's face. I have replayed it many times since, frame by frame, the way you replay a moment you need to understand completely before you can move past it. The expression lasted less than a second. It arrived and departed with the speed of something involuntary, something the body produced before the mind could edit it. It was relief, not disappointment, not frustration, not the expression of a daughter whose father has just declined a practical suggestion. Relief. The brief, unguarded expression of a person who has just been told they do not have to do the thing they came to do. I filed it. I did not yet understand it. I would understand it later. In a kitchen at 2 in the morning. In a different conversation entirely. But I filed it the way I have filed every anomalous reading in 35 years of keeping a light. Carefully. Without interpretation, trusting that the data would tell me what it meant when enough of it had accumulated. Nora put her coat back on. She left the folder on the table. Neither of us commented on this. She kissed me on the cheek, the brief press, and she left. Her car pulled out of the driveway, and the sound of the engine faded down Franklin Avenue. And then there was the silence that always follows a departure from this house, the silence that has a specific shape and weight and temperature. And tonight, it was the shape of a blue folder, sitting on my kitchen table between the salt shaker and June's logbook. A question and an answer sitting side by side. The power of attorney and the warning from a woman who had been dead for 3 years. The document that someone else had written and the note that June had written, both on the same table. Both about the same collection, both about the same family. I sat there until the kitchen went dark with the evening and the fog came down the hill and pressed against the windows the way October fog does when it has nowhere else to be. The folder was still on the table. The pen was still uncapped. June's logbook was still beside the salt shaker where it had been since the morning I brought it down from the locked cabinet to keep her close to where I ate. And somewhere in the back of my mind, from the place where important things wait until you are ready to hear them again, a voice I had not yet attached to a name said the word T. I remembered his words the way a lighthouse remembers its sequence. Not by thinking about it, but because the pattern had been set, and the mechanism had no choice but to follow through. When your daughter brings you tea, do not drink it. Pour it into a glass jar and leave it overnight. The kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove. The small one June installed because she said a kitchen needed a light that could be on without the whole room being on. I stood at the counter with the packet of tea Bryn had left, the third-week blend, the darker one, the one she said was stronger. I held it the way I used to hold a barometric reading that did not match the sky. The numbers said one thing, the weather said another. When that happens, you trust the numbers and look harder at the sky. I went to the pantry. The jar was on the second shelf behind the canned tomatoes. A 16-ounce mason jar with a wire bale lid. The last jar of orange marmalade June made the autumn before the Alzheimer's took her ability to stand at a stove without forgetting why she was standing there. She made marmalade every October. Seville oranges when she could find them. Sugar measured on the kitchen scale she trusted more than any measuring cup. And a patience with the boiling process that I had admired for 30 years without understanding. She would stand at the stove and watch the surface and wait for the color to shift from bright orange to something deeper. Something that meant the pectin had done its work. And she would not move until it did. I had eaten the marmalade months ago. The jar stayed on the shelf because I could not discard a thing her hands had filled. Some containers you keep, not for what they hold but for who held them. I brewed the tea according to the instructions. 5 minutes steeping. I poured it into June's jar, the amber liquid filling the glass the way light fills a lens, and I watched it settle. I sealed the wire bale and held the jar to the stove light. It looked like tea. It smelled like chamomile, with something sharper underneath, the way an engine smells of oil, and also of something that should not be burning. I needed somewhere to put it that Bryn had never reached into. I went through her visits the way you go through an inventory, shelf by shelf, surface by surface. The counter beside the refrigerator, yes, she had set juice there. The cabinet above the stove, yes. The pantry, yes. The spice shelf, yes. She had been everywhere a person needed to be to cook and serve, which was everywhere except one place. The locked cabinet in my study. The one that held June's personal logbooks, the parallel set she had kept alongside mine for 32 years, recording not weather and tide but the domestic equivalent. Meals, visitors, conversations. I had found them after she died. 4 notebooks in her careful handwriting, and I had read 3 pages of the first one, and closed it, because the love visible in the accuracy of her observations was more than I could hold that evening or any evening since. The cabinet was locked. The key had not left my pocket in 3 years. I set the jar behind the logbooks. June's records in front. June's marmalade jar behind. 2 layers of her between the tea and whoever came looking. I locked the cabinet and stood in the dark study with the lighthouse sweeping its beam across the ceiling every 12 seconds, and told June what I had done. She did not answer. The silence had the quality it has when she is listening, but has not yet decided what to say. I went to bed and lay in the dark counting lighthouse sweeps across the ceiling because counting is what I do when my mind needs occupation and my body needs rest, and the two have not agreed on priority. I counted to 70, which was 14 minutes, which was not enough to sleep, and was enough to understand I was not going to. I thought about the jar in the locked cabinet. I thought about the man on Commercial Street and the certainty in his grip. I thought about the pen Nora had placed at the angle a right-handed person would pick it up, and the relief on her face when I did not. Morning came before I was ready. Morning did not care. I stood in front of the locked cabinet at 6:15, with the first gray light coming through the study window and the river visible as a darker line beneath the fog. I unlocked the cabinet, moved June's logbooks aside, and lifted the jar out with both hands. I carried it to the kitchen window where the October light was beginning to separate the sky from the roofline of Hector's house across the fence. I held the jar up to the light. The tea had separated overnight into 2 layers. The lower layer was the amber of the tea itself, unchanged. The upper layer was something else. A film. Thin, oily, iridescent in the early light, the way gasoline looks on a wet surface, floating on the tea the way something floats that does not dissolve in water because it was never meant to be in water. Tea does not leave oil. Herbs do not leave film. Chamomile and valerian do not separate overnight into 2 layers, one of which catches light like a thing with its own surface tension. I know what does not belong in a record. I have been reading records for 35 years. And the first skill you develop, the one that keeps the light running and the ships off the rocks, is the ability to look at a page of data and see the number that is not like the others. The film on the surface of the tea was not like the others. I sealed the jar and locked it back in June's cabinet behind her logbooks. 2 layers of her between the truth and whoever came looking. She had been protecting me from somewhere I could not reach, and I had not known until this morning that I needed protecting. I carried the jar to Dr. Vasquez's office, the way you carry a compass that has just told you the direction you did not want to be heading. Marine Drive runs along the south side of Astoria where the town meets the river flats, past the old fish processing buildings and the marine supply warehouses, and the stretch of waterfront that has been in continuous commercial use since before Oregon was a state. Dr. Lena Vasquez's clinic is in a converted warehouse at the far end, a building that has the good sense to look like what it is, a place where practical things happen without pretending to be anything else. I have been going to her for 15 years. She was June's doctor first. She was the one who sat across her desk and said the word Alzheimer's to us on a Tuesday afternoon in April, while the river traffic moved past the window behind her, and the world continued operating as though the word had not just been said. She delivered it the way she delivered everything, directly, without padding, with the understanding that a diagnosis given gently is still a diagnosis, and the gentleness does not change what comes after. I parked on Marine Drive and sat in the truck for 4 minutes with the jar in my jacket pocket against my chest. I had been carrying it that way since I left the house, pressed against the inside of my coat the way you carry something you cannot afford to set down. Then I went in. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and the particular staleness of a place that recirculates its air because opening the windows would let in the river. Vasquez came out herself rather than sending the nurse, which told me the scheduling nurse had said something about the way I sounded on the phone that morning. I had called at 7:30. I had said I needed to come in. I had not said why. The fact that she came to the waiting room herself was her way of saying she had already begun assessing before the appointment started. Her office was the same as it had always been. Desk, 2 chairs. The window with the river view she never sat facing because she said a doctor who looked at the water while a patient was talking was a doctor who had already made up her mind. She sat facing me. I sat facing the window because I needed something to look at that was not her face while I said what I was about to say. She asked the standard questions. Blood pressure, sleep, appetite, energy levels. I answered them in the order she asked them. Then she asked about recent changes, diet, supplements, anything new in my routine. I set the jar on her desk. She looked at it. She looked at the film on the surface, visible even in the office light. The thin, iridescent layer floating where tea should have been uniform. She tilted the jar once, gently, and watched the film move across the surface and resettle. I told her about the tea. I told her about the supplements, the juice, the tincture, the 6 substances in 3 weeks. I told her about the blurred afternoons and the blank pages in my logbook and the tremor in my hands that had not been there before October. I told her about the metallic taste that arrived every afternoon and stayed through the evening like a guest who had not been invited but knew where the chairs were. She did not write anything down while I was talking. She listened with the stillness of a person who is not merely hearing the words, but sorting them into categories she has been trained to recognize. When I finished, she picked up the phone. She turned slightly away from me. I heard her say a name I did not recognize, and then a phrase that I did recognize, not because I had heard it before, but because the words assembled themselves into meaning with the efficiency of something that had been waiting to be named. She said, possible elder abuse. Chemical. I need a rush analysis. She said it twice. She said it the way a person says a thing, when the person on the other end of the line has asked them to repeat it. Not because they did not hear, but because they needed to be certain. Then she hung up and picked up her notepad and wrote an address on it. She tore the page cleanly and held it across the desk. Oregon State Police Forensic Services Division. Clackamas. An hour and 40 minutes south on the interstate. Go today, she said. Take the jar. Do not open it. Do not transfer the contents. They will need the original container. I took the paper. I folded it into my jacket pocket beside the space the jar had occupied. I looked at her, and she looked at me. And between us was 15 years of the particular trust that develops between a doctor and a patient who have been through the worst thing together and come out the other side of it into whatever this plast was. She had not said she believed me. She had made a phone call. And in the language of doctors, a phone call made before the notepad is a diagnosis already forming. She had heard what I described, and she had not reached for the pen first. She had reached for the phone. That sequence told me everything. The pen records. The phone acts. She had acted before she recorded, which meant what I had brought her was not ambiguous. I stood up. She said one more thing before I reached the door. Hal. She used my first name, which she had done exactly 3 times in 15 years. Once when she told us about June, once when she told me June was gone, and now. How long has this been going on? 3 weeks that I know of, I said. Possibly longer. She nodded. The nod of a woman who has just confirmed something she suspected, the moment I walked into the waiting room. The moment the scheduling nurse said something about the way I sounded, the moment she came out to the waiting room herself instead of sending someone else. I drove to Clackamas in the rain with the jar in my jacket and both hands on the wheel and the radio off. An hour and 40 minutes of highway and river and the Oregon countryside doing what it does in late October, going gold and brown and quiet, letting go of what it carried through the summer without complaint, because that is what living things do when the season tells them it is time. The jar was against my chest. The address was in my pocket. The phone call had already been made, and somewhere behind me on Marine Drive, Dr. Vasquez was writing in her notepad the things she had not written while I was talking, recording them now in the silence after I left, which is when doctors write the things they did not want you to see them writing. The Astoria Police Department on Exchange Street is a building that has been absorbing difficult conversations for longer than I have been keeping alight, and it carries them the way old wood carries weather, in the grain, in the smell, in the particular way the floor gives beneath your weight when you walk toward the front desk, with something you have been carrying alone, and are about to set down. I went the morning after Clackamas. I had driven to the forensic lab in the rain, handed the jar to a technician who received it with both hands and the professional neutrality of a man who handles evidence for a living, and driven home in the dark with the radio off and the empty space in my jacket where the jar had been pressing against my chest for 3 hours. The technician had said 3 to 5 business days. He had said they would call the number on the form. He had not looked at the jar the way a person looks at something unremarkable. He had looked at it the way a person looks at something they have seen a version of before, and that look stayed with me through the drive home and through the night and into the morning when I picked up the phone and called the Astoria Police Department and asked to speak to someone in the investigations unit. Detective Colleen Marsh came down the hallway at 9:20 and introduced herself with a handshake that was brief and firm and did not linger. The handshake of a person who shakes hands as a formality and considers the formality complete the moment contact is released. She was 44 years old, medium height, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of face that gives you nothing until it decides to, the face of someone who has learned that the first person to show an expression in a conversation is the first person to lose control of it. She took me to a small office with 2 chairs and a desk that had nothing on it except a legal pad and a pen. She sat down. She put the pen on the pad. She looked at me and said nothing. I understood the instruction. The instruction was the same instruction you give a fog signal before you calibrate it. You let it run, and you listen to the full sequence before you decide whether the interval needs adjusting. I started talking. I told her about the man on Commercial Street. I told her about the grip on my forearm and the sealed envelope and the name of my dead wife in a stranger's mouth. I told her about June's note, the list of assets, the phrase that I had memorized without trying because some sentences write themselves into you the first time you read them. A woman at Nora's grief group asks too many questions about the collection. I told her about Bryn Sayers, the holistic grief counselor who had arrived in my house 3 weeks ago, carrying tea and warmth and questions about a maritime collection worth $640,000. I told her about the pattern, the 6 substances, the blurred afternoons, the blank pages in a logbook I had kept, without interruption, for 35 years. I told her about the power of attorney, with a specific clause for tangible assets, including collections and artifacts. I told her about the pen placed at the angle a right-handed person would pick it up, and the relief on my daughter's face when I did not. I told her about the jar, the film on the surface, the technician at Clackamas, who had looked at it the way a man looks at something he has seen before. I told her all of it in 15 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind her shoulder, the way I watch instruments when I am running a diagnostic. 15 minutes of a man's life compressed into a sequence of facts delivered in the order they occurred, without editorializing, without asking to be believed, because a man who has spent 35 years keeping a log knows that the data speaks for itself if you present it correctly. She did not write anything down while I was talking. Not a word. Not a name. Not a date. The legal pad sat on the desk between us as blank as the pages in my logbook had been, and the pen sat beside it untouched, and she listened with a stillness I recognized because I had seen it in people who work in conditions where listening is not a courtesy but a professional requirement. When I finished, she picked up the pen. Do you know what it means when a detective listens to 15 minutes of testimony without writing a single note and then picks up the pen? It means she was not taking notes. She was deciding, and the decision was made before I finished the second sentence. and picking up the pen was not the beginning of the process but the confirmation of its conclusion. She wrote for 2 minutes. I sat in the chair and watched her hand move across the pad and felt something I had not felt since the morning I stood in front of June's locked cabinet and opened it. Relief is not the right word. Relief implies the removal of weight. This was more like the weight being redistributed, shifted from one set of shoulders to a set that was designed to carry it. She looked up. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, can you go home and live your life like nothing has changed?" I looked at her and thought about 35 years of keeping a light running through Pacific storms that lasted longer than anyone predicted. I thought about the November gale of 1998 that took the power out for 6 days, and I hand-cranked the backup generator in 4-hour shifts because the shipping lane does not close for weather and the light does not get to have an opinion about whether it wants to. Keep running. I thought about the January ice storm that coated the lens housing in a 1/4 inch of frozen spray, and I climbed the tower in the dark and chipped it clear with a rubber mallet because a foghorn without a clear lens is just noise. "How long?" I asked. "As long as it takes," she said. I looked at the legal pad with her handwriting on it. My life translated into the language of an investigation, and I said, "I kept a light running through 35 years of storms that did not care whether I was tired. I can keep this running for as long as you need." She nodded once. The kind of nod that means, "I hear you, I believe you, and we are finished with the part of this conversation that requires words." I buttoned my coat and walked out of the building onto Exchange Street. The morning was doing what Astoria mornings do in late October. Fog on the river, salt in the air, the town going about its business without knowing that something had just changed inside a small office on the 2nd floor. I stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and felt the weight redistributed and the light still running. I poured her tea down the sink on Tuesday morning and watched it disappear into the drain. The way a lie disappears into a conversation that has already moved on, completely, without residue, as though it had never been there. Bryn arrived at 9:15. She set the tea on the counter, the way she always set things on the counter, with the casual precision of someone placing a chess piece. I poured half into a mug while she watched. I drank it in front of her, 3 slow sips, and set the mug down, and thanked her, and asked about the weather. She watched me drink it with the steady attention of someone confirming a rate of progress, and I let her watch because that was the assignment and I had accepted it. After she left, I poured the remaining half down the sink and rinsed the mug twice and set it on the rack. I had not known until that moment whether I could do it, whether something in me would object to performing gratitude for a thing designed to take me apart. Nothing objected. The man who had looked forward to her visits no longer existed. He had been replaced by someone who could do this and stand at a clean sink afterward, without cracking. I was not sure whether that was strength. I thought it might be a warning about myself. Day 2. Nora came alone in the afternoon. I was in the study when she arrived, standing in front of the framed 1873 chart of the Columbia River Bar, the one I had acquired from a retiring bar pilot 20 years ago, and had looked at nearly every day since. She asked what I was looking at. I said, "This chart. What did June call it?" and watched her face. June had called it the bar chart, which was her joke, because she worked with numbers, and the word bar meant something different in her profession. Nora knew this. Everyone who had been in this house more than once knew this. The question was designed to sound like a man losing the name of a thing he had known for 20 years, and Nora received it exactly that way. Her expression softened into the specific sadness of a daughter watching her father forget. I cataloged that sadness. I did not enjoy producing it. I filed it where I filed the rest of the performance. In the logbook I kept at night, after everyone left, the one I wrote in by the stovelight with the door locked and the pen moving in the small, steady hand I had been trained to produce across 35 years of recording data that ships depended on. Day 3. Bryn came alone. No Nora, no groceries, just Bryn, and a sealed thermos of what she called a concentrated blend, and the focused attention of someone visiting a project rather than a person. She set the thermos on the counter and sat at the kitchen table and watched me the way I have seen ornithologists watch nesting birds through a blind, motionless and patient, and recording everything without needing a notebook because the notebook was already open in her mind. I drank half the thermos in front of her. I talked about the weather. I asked her whether she thought the roses along the south fence needed cutting back before November, which was a question June would have known the answer to instantly, and which I asked because a man losing his faculties asks questions about things he used to know. Bryn answered with the patience of someone running out a clock. After she left, I poured the rest. I rinsed the thermos. I logged it. Day 4. This was the day that mattered. Nora arrived at 10 in the morning with the blue folder. The power of attorney. Second attempt. She set it on the table in the same position she had placed it the first time, between the salt shaker and June's logbook, as though the table had a designated spot for documents that could transfer everything my wife and I had built into someone else's control. I picked it up. I turned the pages slowly, the way a man does when he is reading something he has already forgotten he read. I looked at the signature line. I put my finger on it. "I think I already signed something like this," I said. I said it the way a confused man says something he half remembers, with the upward inflection of uncertainty, the slight squint of a person trying to see through fog that will not clear. I had practiced it. I had practiced it the night before in the bathroom mirror with the door closed, adjusting the angle of my head and the focus of my eyes until the confusion looked involuntary rather than constructed. Bryn was not in the room, but she was in the house. She had arrived with Nora, gone to the kitchen to make tea, and I heard her stop moving when I said it. The particular silence of someone who has been waiting for a specific sound and has just heard it. Nora said, "No, Dad, this is the first time. We talked about it last week. Remember?" I said, "Right, right," and nodded, and set the folder down, and rubbed my forehead the way a man does when the gears are slipping and he knows it. And over Nora's shoulder, through the doorway into the kitchen, I saw Bryn's face. The flicker. It lasted less than a second. The brief, unguarded expression of professional satisfaction. The expression of a woman watching a mechanism she had designed perform exactly as intended. Not joy. Not relief. Satisfaction. The face of a person watching a schedule proceed on time. I saw it. I logged it, not in the daytime logbook that sat on the table in plain sight, but in the one I kept in my head until the house was empty and the stove light was on and the pen was in my hand and the page was waiting. Day 5. I performed a full afternoon of confusion. I opened the wrong cabinet twice. I stood in the hallway and looked at the coat hook where June's raincoat hung and said her name as though I expected her to answer. I asked Nora what month it was. I called her June once, corrected myself, and watched the pain in her eyes deepen into something I recognized as the beginning of acceptance, the acceptance of a daughter who is starting to believe her father is becoming what her mother became. That was the cruelest part of the performance. Not the lying, the using. I was using my daughter's deepest wound as a stage, and I was performing on it with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had decided it was necessary. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the night logbook. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote down everything Bryn had said, everything Nora had said, every expression I had catalogued, every thermos I had poured, and every mug I had rinsed. 11 cups of tea down the drain in 5 days. 11 performances of gratitude for a substance designed to erase me. Tomorrow morning, the lab at Clackamas would call with results, and the performance would have an ending. I closed the logbook and locked it in June's cabinet behind her notebooks, and sat in the dark study with the lighthouse sweeping the ceiling every 12 seconds, and I thought about the word performance and what it costs when the audience is your own daughter, and the stage is the kitchen where your wife made marmalade every October until she could not remember how. I was in the truck before the coffee finished brewing. I left it on the counter and drove south on Highway 30 in the dark, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the river running beside me in the direction I was already heading. The forensic lab in Clackamas is a building that has no interest in being approachable. Concrete and glass, and a parking lot that was half empty at 7 in the morning, which meant I had arrived before the shift change, which meant I had been driving for an hour and 40 minutes without remembering most of it. The body takes over when the mind has already decided where it is going. I have driven boats in fog, using nothing but compass heading and engine sound, and this was the same thing. A destination and a straight line, and the understanding that what waited at the end would change the shape of everything behind it. The woman at the intake window handed me the envelope without ceremony. Standard issue. Institutional beige. The state seal in the upper left corner. My name typed on the label in a font that has not been updated since the building was built. I took it with both hands and did not open it at the counter because some things require a specific kind of privacy. Not the privacy of secrecy, but the privacy of a man who needs to be alone with what he is about to learn. I sat in the truck. I opened the envelope. The report was 3 pages. I read the conclusion first. That is how I have read every document that mattered since the day Dr. Vasquez said Alzheimer's. Find the name of what is wrong before you go back and understand how it got there. The name was on page 3, second paragraph, in language that was clinical and precise and did not care about the person reading it. Scopolamine. Tropane alkaloid compound. Consistent with repeated low-dose oral administration. Effects include confusion, memory impairment, suggestibility, and impaired judgment. Concentration consistent with sustained exposure over a period of approximately 3 to 4 weeks. I read it again. I read it a third time. Scopolamine. Memory impairment. Suggestibility. I want you to sit with those words the way I sat with them, in a truck, in a parking lot in Clackamas, at 7:30 in the morning with the engine off and the November rain on the windshield, and the understanding arriving not all at once but in layers, the way understanding arrives when what you are understanding is too large to enter through a single door. Scopolamine does not kill you. I want to be clear about that. It does not stop your heart, or shut down your organs, or do any of the things that poisons do in the stories people tell about poisons. What it does is softer and worse. It takes your mind. It takes the part of your mind that says no. The part that reads a document and understands what signing it means. The part that looks at a stranger in your kitchen and asks why she knows where the honey is. It takes the gatekeeping function of a human brain and dissolves it the way fog dissolves a horizon, gradually, invisibly, until the person standing in the fog does not remember there was ever a horizon to see. She had chosen the one weapon that would look like what had already happened to my family. Not a new disease. A continuation of the old one. A man whose wife died of Alzheimer's begins showing signs of cognitive decline. And everyone nods and says it is the cruelest kind of coincidence, and no one looks at the tea. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes. I know because I watched the dashboard clock the way I watch instruments when I am running a diagnostic, and need the data to be precise, even when nothing else is. 20 minutes of sitting in a parking lot in the rain with a 3-page report that explained everything I had been feeling for a month and named it in a word I had to look up on my phone to be sure I understood. Scopolamine. From the plant genus Scopolia, related to nightshade. Used medicinally, in small doses for motion sickness. Used criminally in larger doses to produce a compliant, suggestible, amnesiac state in the victim, known in some countries as the devil's breath. My daughter had been handing me the devil's breath in a ceramic teapot with a handwritten card that said "for restful nights," and I had been drinking it and thanking her and sleeping the deep dark sleep and waking with my hands, not my own, and my logbook blank, and my name slowly dissolving in a jar that looked like kindness. I started the truck. I drove to Astoria in the rain. I did not turn on the radio. I did not stop for coffee. I drove with the report on the passenger seat, and both hands on the wheel, and the words sitting in the cab like a passenger who takes up more room than the seat provides. Marsh was at her desk. She looked at me the way she had looked at me the first time, with the stillness of someone who does not need you to tell her what you are carrying, because she can read it in the way you walk through the door. I set the report on her desk and sat down. She read it. She read it the way a detective reads evidence. Once for content, once for implication. Then, she looked up. "We found her pattern," she said. 2 other families. A widower in Bend, 71 years old, similar presentation, similar timeline. A retired couple in Medford, both in their late 60s. Same method. She has done this before. 3 families. 3 sets of supplements, and tea, and warmth, delivered on a schedule designed to look like love. 3 sets of documents waiting for signatures from people whose capacity to understand what they were signing had been chemically removed. Bryn Sayers was not a grief counselor who had crossed a line. She was a system, a method, a professional architecture of extraction built on the understanding that a person in grief is a person with the doors unlocked, Marsh said. The investigation is active. We are coordinating with Bend and Medford. I need you to stay in position. I nodded. I did not need to ask what staying in position meant. It meant the performance was not over. It meant tomorrow morning Bryn would arrive with tea, and I would pour half and smile, and the light would keep running, because that is what lights do when ships are in the channel. I drove home with the word in the passenger seat, and the rain on the windshield, and the understanding that my daughter's grief counselor had done this to 2 other families, and had come to mine through the one door I had left. Open, the door marked with the word that means the most and protects the least. Healing. The morning was quiet in a way that made me count things. 7 cedar shingles loose on the south side of the porch, 4 crows on the telephone wire above the driveway, 1 glass jar of orange marmalade, empty, sitting on the kitchen counter where June used to keep it full. I had been awake since 4, watching the fog crawl up from the river like it always does in late January. Slow and deliberate, as if the Columbia itself were breathing. Bryn was coming at 10. Detective Marsh had called the night before from a number I did not recognize. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. She said Bryn had purchased another 1/4 pound of loose-leaf herbal blend from a supplier in Portland. The same blend the Clackamas lab had already cataloged. She said the operation would happen at my kitchen table. She said I should do exactly what I had been doing for the past 11 days. Open the door. Accept the tea. Sit down. And talk about the fog or the river or whatever old men talk about when they are pretending to forget. Then she said something that stayed with me after I hung up. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, you have kept a light running for 35 years. Keep it running for 1 more morning." I set the phone on the counter beside the marmalade jar and stood there for a while. At 9:15 I did what I always do. I opened the logbook, wrote the date January 28, and recorded the weather. Overcast, 42 degrees, wind from the southwest at 6 knots. Visibility approximately 1/4 mile. I wrote it the way I had written every entry since 1986, in blue ink, in block letters that June once said looked like a man building a fence 1 post at a time. Then I closed the book and placed it in the cabinet beside the 3-page lab report and the cream-colored envelope with her handwriting on the front. At 9:40 I heard tires on the gravel. I did not look out the window. I knew what Marsh had arranged. 2 unmarked vehicles parked on Hector's property next door, behind the woodpile where Hector stacks his firewood every November. 1 officer positioned at the back porch, near the door that leads to the garden where June planted roses in 1994. Marsh herself was in Hector's living room, watching my front door through binoculars. Hector had agreed without hesitation. He had said only one thing: "Tell me where to stand." The knock came at exactly 10. I opened the door the way I had opened it every Saturday for the past 7 weeks. Slowly, because my hands were supposed to be unreliable now. I let my left hand tremble against the doorframe, a gesture I had practiced in the bathroom mirror until it looked involuntary. Bryn stood on the porch in her green wool coat, holding a paper bag in one hand and a ceramic teapot in the other. The teapot was the same one she had brought the first time, white, with a thin crack along the handle that she never mentioned. "Good morning, Hal," she said. "I brought you something warm." I stepped aside and let her in. She moved through the house the way she always did, efficient and gentle, hanging her coat on the hook by the door, placing the teapot on the stove, pulling 2 cups from the shelf above the sink. She knew where everything was. She had memorized this kitchen, the way a cartographer memorizes a coastline, not for love of the landscape, but for the precision it affords. I sat at the table. She poured. The tea was the same color it had always been, a dark amber that caught the overhead light and held it. She placed the cup in front of me and sat across the table, her hands folded, her posture open, her eyes steady. She was good at this. She was better at this than anyone I had met in 73 years of meeting people. And I had met fishermen who could lie about the size of a catch with the sincerity of a priest. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. "Foggy," I said. It was not a lie. She nodded, the way she always nodded, slow, measured, as if my confusion confirmed something she had already written down. I lifted the cup. I brought it close enough to smell the bergamot and the something else underneath, the faint mineral edge that the lab report had identified as the solvent carrier for scopolamine. I tilted the cup toward my lips. Then I set it down. "I want to show you something," I said. I reached into the cabinet behind me and placed the 3-page lab report on the table between the cup and the teapot. I placed June's envelope beside it. I placed the logbook open to the page where I had recorded every cup she poured, every supplement she brought, every question she asked about the collection. Bryn looked at the papers. She did not move. She did not breathe. Or if she did, I could not see it. Her hands stayed folded. Her posture stayed open. But something behind her eyes closed, the way a lighthouse shutter drops when the mechanism fails. "Hal," she said. The front door opened. Detective Marsh came through first, badge visible on a lanyard around her neck, followed by 2 uniformed officers from the Astoria Police Department. One officer moved to the back door. The other stood beside the refrigerator, blocking the only path to the hallway. Marsh walked to the table and looked at the teapot, the cup, the lab report, the envelope, and the logbook. She looked at Bryn. "Bryn Sayers, you are under arrest for assault in the 1st degree, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." Bryn did not resist. She stood, placed her hands behind her back, and let the officer guide her wrists into the handcuffs. She walked through the kitchen doorway, past the hook where her coat still hung, past the porch where she had knocked 7 minutes ago, and into the unmarked car parked at the edge of my driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the car pull away. The fog was still thick, and within 30 seconds, the taillights were gone. Marsh stayed. She sat across from me in the chair Bryn had been sitting in, moved the untouched cup of tea to the side, and placed a small digital recorder on the table. "We need your formal statement," she said. "Take your time." I looked at the teapot. The thin crack along the handle was still there, a flaw she had carried into my home week after week without ever acknowledging it. I thought about how many times I had almost drunk from it. I thought about the 2 other families Marsh had mentioned, the widower in Bend, the couple in Medford, and wondered if they had kitchens like mine, with logbooks and marmalade jars and cabinets that held the last handwriting of someone who loved them. "Start from the beginning," Marsh said. I opened the logbook to the first page I had written after Tadashi's warning and began to read aloud. The house was different after the arrest. Not quieter, it had always been quiet, but emptier in a way that had weight to it, the way a ship feels after the cargo has been unloaded and the hull sits high in the water, exposed to wind it was never meant to meet. Marsh came back 2 days later, on a Thursday. She stood on the porch and asked if she could see the collection. Not the logbook, Not the envelope. Not the jar. The collection. The thing Bryn had been circling for 7 weeks, the way a current circles a reef before it finds the gap. I had not opened that room since June went to the facility. 22 months. I told Marsh this as I turned the key. A brass skeleton key that June had found at an estate sale in Cannon Beach in 1998, and insisted we use, because it looked like something a lighthouse keeper would carry. She was right. It did. The door swung inward, and the smell came first. Cedar, old paper, brass polish, and salt. Not ocean salt, the salt that accumulates on metal when it has lived near water for more than a century. The room was 12 feet by 14 feet, built into the northeast corner of the house where the morning light came through 2 tall, narrow windows. June had chosen those windows because they faced the river, and she said the collection should always be able to see the water it came from. Marsh stepped inside and stopped. Along the east wall, floor to ceiling, were the shelves I had built in 1993 from reclaimed Douglas fir. On them sat 47 items, each one tagged with a small white card in June's handwriting: item name, origin, estimated date, acquisition date, and a single sentence of provenance. A brass binnacle compass from a Columbia River bar pilot vessel, circa 1889. A sextant with an ivory arc, stamped by a London maker whose shop had been destroyed in the Blitz. A fog bell from the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, decommissioned in 1957, still carrying a patina of green that no amount of polish could remove. A set of signal flags from a Liberty ship that had been built in Portland during the war and sunk off Okinawa in 1945, recovered by a diver in the 1970s and sold to a dealer in Newport who sold them to June for $80 at a time when neither of us understood what they were worth. On the west wall hung the charts, 11 hand-drawn coastal survey maps from the mid-19th century, mounted under glass, each one showing a section of the Oregon coastline in ink lines so precise they looked mechanical. They were not. They had been drawn by a cartographer named Elias Rook, who had mapped every rock, shoal, and channel between the Columbia River and Coos Bay between 1858 and 1871. June had found 3 of them at an auction in Seattle. The other 8 she had tracked down over 14 years, writing letters to maritime museums, historical societies, and private collectors across 4 states. The last one arrived 3 weeks before she forgot my name. Marsh walked along the shelves without touching anything. She leaned close to read June's cards, moved to the charts, then turned to face me. The appraised value, she said. It was not a question. $640,000, I said. That was 4 years ago. June had it done when she started forgetting things. She said if she could not remember what each piece was, at least the paper would. And the current value? The Rook charts alone are worth more than the house. A collector in San Francisco offered $350,000 for the complete set last year. I did not respond. Marsh wrote something in her notebook. She looked at the fog bell, then at me. This is why, she said. I knew what she meant. This room was the reason Bryn had joined the grief group. The reason she had befriended Nora. The reason she had carried a teapot into my kitchen every Saturday for 7 weeks and poured scopolamine into cups she watched me almost drink. Not the house. Not the savings. Not the life insurance policy. This room, these 47 objects and 11 charts that June had spent 30 years gathering and cataloging with the patience of someone who believed that the sea gives things back if you wait long enough. She knew the inventory, Marsh said. We found a spreadsheet on her laptop. Every item, every card description, every estimated value. She had already identified 3 buyers, 2 in Seattle, 1 in Tokyo. I sat down on the wooden stool beside the door, the same stool where June used to sit when she was writing her catalog cards. The wood was worn smooth on the left side where she rested her elbow. How did she get the descriptions? I asked. Marsh closed her notebook. Your daughter. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. It did not shatter anything. It simply sank, and the ripples moved outward until they touched every wall. Nora photographed the cards. Marsh continued. She says Bryn told her it was for insurance purposes. She says she did not know what the photographs would be used for. Do you believe her? I believe she did not ask enough questions. Whether that is the same as not knowing is something the court will decide. I looked at the shelves. At the binnacle compass that still pointed north after 135 years. At the sextant that had measured the angle between stars and horizons on nights when the only technology a sailor had was glass, brass, and mathematics. At June's cards, her handwriting still legible, still precise, still holding the memory she could no longer hold herself. She built this room, I said. Everything in it. Every card. Every letter she wrote to find a piece. Marsh nodded. That is why we will make sure it stays yours. She left at noon. I locked the room, put the skeleton key in my shirt pocket, and walked to the kitchen. The teapot was gone. Marsh had taken it as evidence 2 days ago. The table was bare except for the logbook and the salt shaker. I sat down and opened the book to a blank page. I wrote, January 30. Clear morning. Collection room opened for the first time in 22 months. June's cards are still legible. Everything she gathered is still here. Everything. Then I closed the book and sat in the quiet house, listening to the river below the hill, thinking about the woman who had taught me that the most valuable things in a room are always the ones someone wrote by hand. She came on a Tuesday, which told me something was wrong. Nora never came on Tuesdays. Tuesdays were her writing days. She had told me this once. Years ago, with the kind of firmness that made it sound like a border she had drawn around herself. Tuesday was the day she closed her apartment door, turned off her phone, and sat at the desk she had inherited from June. She did not answer knocks. She did not make calls. She wrote. The fact that she was standing on my porch at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday in February meant that whatever she was carrying was heavier than her routine could hold. I opened the door. She was wearing June's gray scarf, the one with the moth hole near the left fringe that June had never repaired, because she said imperfections were how you knew something had been loved. Nora's eyes were swollen. Not red, not teary swollen. The way eyes look when a person has been crying for long enough that the crying has stopped but the face has not recovered. She did not say hello. She walked past me into the kitchen, sat in the chair where Bryn had been sitting 9 days ago, when Marsh came through the front door, and placed her hands flat on the table. I need to tell you something, she said. I sat across from her. The table was bare. No teapot, no folder, no cup. Just the wood, the salt shaker, and the space between us. I know about the photographs, I said. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was looking at the salt shaker, not at me. Bryn asked me in November, she said. She said she was building a digital archive for insurance purposes. She said if anything happened to you, a fire, a flood, a break-in, there would be a record of every item in the collection. She said it was a gift, something I could do for you that you would never do for yourself. And you believed her. I wanted to believe her. Nora's voice did not break. It flattened, the way a wave flattens when it reaches shallow water and has nowhere left to rise. Dad, I have been trying to do something useful for this family since Mom went into the facility. I cook her soup. I bring you groceries. I drive 40 minutes each way to sit in a room where she does not recognize me, and I read to her from books she used to read to me. And when I leave, I sit in my car in the parking lot and I do not cry, because if I start, I am not sure I will be able to drive home. Bryn made me feel like I was finally doing something that mattered. Something practical. Something that would protect what Mom built. I listened. I did not interrupt. This is something the lighthouse taught me when the fog is thick and you cannot see what is coming. You do not shout into it. You keep the light steady, and you wait. She came to the grief group in September, Nora continued. She sat next to me. She asked about Mom, about the disease, about what it was like to watch someone disappear while their body stayed. Nobody had asked me that before. Not like that. Not with that kind of patience. Patience is a tool, I said. It can build a house or pick a lock. Nora looked at me for the first time since she sat down. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger, not guilt, but recognition. The recognition that a metaphor can be a mirror. I took 43 photographs, she said. Every shelf, every card, every chart. I sent them to her in 3 emails over 2 weeks. She asked me to include the provenance notes and the estimated values. I did. Did she tell you about the buyers? No. Nora's hands pressed harder against the table. I did not know about the buyers, the spreadsheet, or the she stopped. The tea. I did not know about the tea. Dad, I believed her. Not because her words were convincing. Words are easy to shape, especially for a writer, but because of the moth hole in the scarf. Nora had chosen to wear June's scarf today. The one with the imperfection. The one that said, I have been loved and I am not trying to hide it. A person planning deception does not wear evidence of vulnerability around her neck. Marsh says the court will decide whether you knew, I said. I know what Marsh says. What do you say? Nora pulled her hands from the table and placed them in her lap. She looked at the window, at the fog that was sitting on the river the way it always sits in February, low, patient, unwilling to leave. I say I was lonely, she said. I say Mom is in a room where she calls me the girl with the nice voice, and you are in a house where you write in a logbook every morning like the world still needs a record of the weather in Astoria, Oregon, and I am in an apartment where I write stories that no one reads about people who do not exist. Bryn saw that. She walked into that empty space and filled it, and I did not ask what she was filling it with. The kitchen was silent. Outside, a truck passed on the road below the hill, its engine fading into the fog the way all engines do on this stretch, quickly, completely, as if the road itself swallows the sound. You are not the villain in this story, Nora. I am not the hero either. No, I said. You are the daughter. That is harder than both. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. I held them the way I used to hold her hand when she was small, and we walked along the jetty at Fort Stevens, her boots slipping on the wet rocks, my grip the only thing between her and the tide pools she wanted to explore, but was not yet steady enough to reach. We sat like that for a long time. The fog did not lift. The river kept moving beneath it. Invisible but audible. The way grief moves through a family, you cannot always see it, but you can hear it if you stop talking long enough to listen. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door and touched the hook where Bryn's coat used to hang. She left a mark, Nora said. On all of us. I nodded. Marks can be sanded down. Your mother taught me that. Nora pulled June's scarf tighter around her neck and walked into the fog. I watched until the gray swallowed her. The same way it had swallowed Tadashi on Commercial Street. The same way it had swallowed the unmarked car carrying Bryn. Astoria takes everyone into its fog eventually. The question is whether they come back. I closed the door and walked to the cabinet. I opened it, looked at June's envelope, the lab report, and the logbook. Then I reached past all of them to the back of the shelf, where a small framed photograph sat face down. I picked it up. June and Nora, 1994, standing in the collection room on the day I finished the shelves. Nora was 6. She was holding the fog bell with both hands, grinning. And June was behind her with one hand on each of Nora's shoulders, looking not at the camera but at the shelves, as if she could already see every object that would eventually fill them. I placed the photograph upright on the shelf and closed the cabinet. The Clatsop County Courthouse sits on Commercial Street, 6 blocks south of the pharmacy where Tadashi grabbed my arm. I had driven past it thousands of times in 35 years and never once gone inside. It is a building made of stone and certainty, and I had spent most of my life avoiding both, preferring wood, water, and the honest uncertainty of fog. On the morning of March 11, I parked the truck in the same lot where I park when I pick up my prescription. I walked the 6 blocks in 12 minutes. The fog was thin that day, which felt wrong. The story had started in thick fog, and I wanted it to end the same way a tide returns to the line it left. But weather does not care about narrative, and the courthouse steps were dry and fully lit when I climbed them at 8:45. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. 4 rows of wooden benches on each side of a center aisle. A raised bench for the judge. A witness stand to the left. 2 tables facing forward, prosecution on the right. Defense on the left. The wood was oak, stained dark. And it reminded me of the shelves I had built in the collection room, except these shelves held people instead of compasses. Bryn was already seated at the defense table. She wore a navy blazer I had never seen, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in front of her, the same way they had been folded in my kitchen. The posture was identical. The context had changed entirely. The prosecution called me first. I walked to the stand the way I walked to the lantern room, 1 step at a time. Hand on the railing. Aware that the height changes the view but not the obligation. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Claire Whitfield, asked me to state my name, my age, and my relationship to the defendant. Then she asked me to describe what happened, starting from the first Saturday Bryn entered my house. I told them everything. The teapot with the cracked handle, the herbal blend she called a grief tea, the supplements, magnesium, melatonin, the adaptogenic tincture with the handwritten label, the way my afternoons turned soft and unreliable, the 2 blank pages in a logbook that had not missed a day since 1986, the metallic taste that arrived in the 3rd week and never fully left, the hand tremor, the power of attorney Nora brought, with its clause about the collection, the jar of tea I poured instead of drank, following the warning of a man I did not know, the oily film that floated to the surface by morning, the lab report, the 3-page document that identified scopolamine as the compound being delivered through my kitchen table twice a week for 7 weeks. Whitfield placed the lab report into evidence. She placed the logbook into evidence. She placed June's envelope, the one with her handwriting on the front, into evidence, along with the asset list and the warning note dated 4 years before. She placed into evidence the spreadsheet recovered from Bryn's laptop. 47 items, 11 charts, estimated total value $640,000, with 3 prospective buyers identified by name and city. Then she asked, "Mr. Whitmore, did the defendant ever state her intentions regarding your collection?" "No," I said. She never mentioned it directly. She asked about it once, in my kitchen, during her first visit. I did not answer. She never asked again. In your opinion, why did she stop asking? Because she found someone who would answer for her. I did not look at Nora when I said it. She was sitting in the 2nd row behind the prosecution table, wearing June's gray scarf, her hands in her lap. I did not need to look. I knew she heard it. I knew it landed. The defense attorney, a man from Portland named David Aldis, asked me 3 questions. Whether I had ever been diagnosed with cognitive decline. Whether I had any prior conflict with the defendant. Whether the man who warned me at the pharmacy had identified himself or provided credentials. I answered no to all 3. Aldis nodded and said he had nothing further. The prosecution then called Detective Marsh, who presented the case file. Bryn's history in 3 Oregon cities. The 2 prior victims in Bend and Medford. The pattern of grief group infiltration. The escalation from companionship to supplements to chemical incapacitation, and the end goal in each case, transfer of assets through fraudulent power of attorney. Marsh's testimony took 40 minutes. She spoke the way she wrote, precise, unadorned, and without a single unnecessary word. The forensic chemist from the Clackamas lab testified for 20 minutes. She confirmed the compound, the concentration, the delivery method, and the projected timeline. At the dosage Bryn was administering, full cognitive impairment indistinguishable from moderate dementia would have occurred within 8 to 12 weeks. I was in week 7 when I poured the tea into the jar. 5 weeks. I had 5 weeks left before I would have become a man who could not remember his own wife's name. Sitting in a house full of her handwriting, signing papers I could no longer read. The judge, a woman named Patricia Yoon, listened without expression. When the defense rested, Bryn did not testify. Judge Yoon recessed for 90 minutes. When she returned, she read the verdict and sentencing in a voice that carried no more emotion than a weather report, which, in its own way, was appropriate. Guilty on all counts. Assault in the first degree. 3 counts of elder abuse. Attempted fraud. Conspiracy to commit theft by deception. Sentence: 16 years. With eligibility for parole after 12. Bryn stood when the sentence was read. She did not flinch. She did not look at me. She looked straight ahead, at the oak wall behind the judge's bench, as if she were reading something there that no one else could see. Then the officer guided her through the side door and she was gone. Nora was not charged. The district attorney's office had reviewed her cooperation, her testimony during the investigation, and the 43 photographs she had voluntarily surrendered. Whitfield told me afterward, in the hallway, that Nora's actions constituted unwitting facilitation, not conspiracy. She was a tool, Whitfield said, not a partner. I did not correct the language, but I felt it land the wrong way. The way a nail lands, when the hammer is slightly off-center, it goes in, but it bends. I walked out of the courthouse at 2:17 in the afternoon. The fog had come in while I was inside, thick and gray, and low against the street, as if it had been waiting. I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed it in. It smelled like the river, like salt, like the space between knowing and not knowing that I had been living in since October. 6 blocks north, the pharmacy was still open. I could see its sign through the fog. Just barely, the green letters glowing the way a channel marker glows when you are coming home at night. And the only thing between you and the rocks is a light someone remembered to turn on. I walked to the truck and drove home. I found him because of the handwriting. After the trial, I spent a week doing nothing but sitting in the kitchen with the logbook open and the cabinet unlocked. The house was quieter than it had been since the arrest, not the heavy quiet of before, but a thinner kind, the kind that comes after a storm passes and the sea goes flat, and you realize the silence is not absence but exhaustion. The river still moved below the hill. The fog still came and went. I still wrote the weather every morning. But the urgency was gone, and in its place was a question I had been carrying since October. Who was the man on Commercial Street? June's envelope had given me his handwriting, the cream-colored paper. The single word on the front, June written in ink, that was neither blue nor black, but somewhere between, the shade you get when you mix 2 pens because one ran out, and you did not want to stop writing. I had looked at that word 100 times. I knew the slant, the way the J leaned left like a person bracing against wind, the way the E did not fully close. But handwriting alone does not tell you a name. The asset list told me more. June had written the inventory in her own hand, but at the bottom of the second page, below the total, there was a line I had overlooked in October. Appraised by T. Maury. Pacific Maritime Antiques. Cannon Beach. Or. June 2021. A name. An address. A date. I drove to Cannon Beach on a Wednesday. The shop was on Hemlock Street, a narrow storefront between a gallery selling ocean paintings and a cafe that smelled like butter and rain. The sign above the door read Pacific Maritime Antiques Est. 1,988 inches letters that had been repainted recently. White on dark green. A brass ship's bell hung beside the door. I recognized the type of bridge-wing bell, probably from a cargo vessel, mid-20th century. June would have known the exact decade. The man behind the counter was the man from the pharmacy. He was shorter than I remembered. Or perhaps I had been sitting when he grabbed my arm and the angle had changed everything. He wore a flannel shirt, reading glasses on a cord, and an expression that was neither surprised nor unsurprised. It was the expression of a person who had been expecting a visitor but did not know which day the visitor would arrive. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, You know my name. I have known your name for 30 years. June talked about you the way navigators talk about the North Star constantly, reliably, and as if the entire system depended on your position. He came around the counter and extended his hand. His grip was the same as it had been in October. Dry, warm, firm, without being forceful. Tadashi Mori, he said. I was your wife's appraiser, her colleague, and her friend. He offered me tea. I hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was long enough for him to notice. Green tea, he said. Nothing in it but leaves and hot water. I will drink from the same pot. We sat at a small table in the back of the shop, surrounded by compasses, barometers, rolled charts, and a collection of lighthouse lenses that caught the window light and scattered it across the walls in pale rainbows. He told me the story the way June would have chronologically, precisely, without unnecessary detail. They had met in 1993, the year after June started collecting. She had brought the sextant to his shop for authentication. He confirmed it was genuine. London made. 1,842. And worth considerably more than the $40 she had paid at an estate sale in Seaside. After that, she came back with every new piece, the binnacle compass, the signal flags, the fog bell, and eventually the first 3 rook charts. Over the years, their relationship became what he called a parallel friendship. 2 people who shared a specific kind of knowledge and a specific kind of patience, meeting in a shop full of objects that had survived the sea. She told me about the disease in 2020, he said. She came in with the last rook chart, the 11th, and asked me to appraise the full collection. She said she needed a number on paper because soon she would not be able to hold the number in her head. We spent 3 hours going through every item. She wrote every card that day, all 47. She already knew she was losing them. He paused. He looked at a lighthouse lens on the shelf behind me, and for a moment, his face held the same expression I see in the mirror when I think about June's handwriting. Before she left, she gave me a sealed envelope. She said, "If anything happens to Harold that does not make sense, open this and do what it says." I put it in my safe. I did not open it for 4 years. What made you open it? A woman came into my shop in September. She said she was researching Oregon maritime collections for an insurance company. She asked about private collectors in the area. She was careful she did not mention your name or June's, but she described 3 specific items. A binnacle compass from a bar pilot vessel, a set of signal flags from a Liberty ship, and a complete set of Rook coastal surveys. There is only one collection in Oregon that contains all 3. Bryn. I did not know her name then. I knew only that someone was asking about June's life's work with the specificity of a person who had already seen the inventory. I went home that night and opened the envelope. What did it say? Tadashi reached beneath the counter and produced a piece of paper. Folded once, in June's handwriting. He placed it on the table between our cups, the way I had placed the lab report between the teapot and the cup in my kitchen. I unfolded it. Tadashi, if someone comes asking about the collection, it means they have found Harold. Go to the pharmacy on Commercial Street, where he picks up his prescription on Wednesdays. Tell him not to trust what his daughter brings him. Tell him to test it. Do not explain more than he needs to hear. He is stubborn, but he listens when it matters. Keep him safe. I cannot do it anymore. June. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and placed it in my shirt pocket beside the skeleton key. She knew, I said. She knew before she forgot. Tadashi said, "That is the cruelest part." She saw it coming clearly enough to write instructions, and then the disease took the memory of having written them. The last time she came to my shop, she looked at the Rook charts on my wall and said, "Those are beautiful. Where did you find them?" They were hers. She had tracked them down over 14 years. We sat in the quiet shop while the light shifted through the lighthouse lenses and moved across the table. The rainbows touched our cups, the paper, our hands, and then moved on, The way light always does it visits, but it does not stay. Thank you, I said. For keeping the promise. I did not keep it for you, he said. I kept it for her. I drove home along the coast road, the ocean on my left, the paper in my pocket pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. June had written those words when she still could. She had sealed them, given them to a man she trusted, and then walked into the fog of her own, forgetting, leaving behind a map for me to follow when the time came. The time had come. I had followed the map. The light was still running. I visited June on the first Saturday of April. The facility is in Warrenton, 8 miles south of the house. A single-story building with wide hallways and windows that face a courtyard garden no one uses in winter. I had been coming every week since she moved in. 23 months now. Always on Saturday. Always at 10. Always carrying the same thing, a thermos of coffee for myself and a small jar of orange marmalade for her. Because even after she stopped recognizing my face, she still reached for the jar the moment I set it on her bedside table. The body remembers what the mind releases. I have watched it happen enough times to know it is not poetry. It is just the way loss works. It takes the names first, then the faces, then the voices. But it leaves the hands alone. She was sitting by the window when I came in. The light was on her lap, pale and warm. The kind of light that April gives to the coast when the fog decides to rest for an afternoon. Her hair was shorter than the last time the nurses cut it every few weeks, and her hands were folded on a blue blanket that I did not recognize. Someone had placed a vase of daffodils on the table. I did not know who. "Good morning, June," I said. She looked at me the way she always looks at me now, with the polite interest of a person meeting someone for the first time at a gathering where she is not entirely sure she was invited. "Hello," she said. "Are you the one who brings the marmalade?" "I am." "Then sit down." "I have been waiting." I sat. I placed the jar on her table. She reached for it immediately, turning it in her hands, reading the label, the way she used to read provenance cards carefully, as if the words contained a history she needed to preserve. She could not open the jar anymore. I opened it for her, the way I had opened it every Saturday for 23 months. She dipped her finger in and tasted it, and for 1 second her face changed not into recognition, not into memory, but into something adjacent to both, a warmth that had no name and needed none. "This is good," she said. "Did you make it?" "You did," I said. "A long time ago. I must have been a good cook. You were good at everything." She smiled. It was not the smile I married. That smile had a sharpness to it, an edge of mischief that could cut a conversation open and find the joke inside. This smile was softer, rounder, the smile of a woman who had put down every burden she ever carried and did not remember picking them up in the first place. I did not know which smile I preferred. I did not need to decide. I told her about the house. I told her the cedar shingles on the south side needed replacing, and that Hector had offered to help. I told her the river was high this week because of the rain. I told her the fog had been thin for 3 days, which was unusual for early April. I did not tell her about the tea, the lab report, the courtroom, or the woman who had tried to take everything she built. She did not need to carry that. She had already carried it once in the letter she wrote to Tadashi, in the asset list she compiled, in the warning note she sealed in an envelope and addressed in handwriting that leaned slightly left, like a person bracing against a wind only she could feel. She had done her part. The rest was mine. Before I left, I placed June's letter on the table beside the marmalade jar. Not the envelope, the letter itself, the one Tadashi had given me, the one she had written in the shop surrounded by lighthouse lenses and compasses and the collected debris of a century of ships. I unfolded it so the handwriting faced up. "Someone wrote this for you," I said. "Would you like me to read it?" "Please." I read it aloud. Every word. "Tadashi, if someone comes asking about the collection, it means they have found Harold. Go to the pharmacy on Commercial Street." She listened with her hands around the marmalade jar, her eyes on the window, her face holding the same polite interest she had shown when I walked in. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Harold," she said. "That is a good name. It is my name. I know," she said. Then she looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, and for 1/2 second I saw it. The old sharpness, the mischief, the woman who had tracked down 11 hand-drawn maps over 14 years and catalogued 47 objects in handwriting, so precise it outlasted her own memory. It was there, behind the fog. The way a lighthouse beam is there, even when you cannot see it from shore. You know it is turning, because the darkness blinks. Then it was gone, and she was looking at the daffodils again. I kissed her forehead, closed the marmalade jar, and left the room. Nora was waiting in the parking lot. She was leaning against her car with her arms crossed, wearing June's gray scarf despite the warmth. She had started coming with me on Saturdays, not into the room, not yet, but to the parking lot, then to the hallway, then last week to the doorway where she stood and watched while June ate marmalade, and I talked about the weather. She was getting closer. Grief moves at its own speed, and I had learned long ago that you do not push a tide. "How is she?" Nora asked. She said my name. Nora unfolded her arms. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We drove home in separate cars, the way we always do, following the coast road north along the river. The fog was coming in from the Pacific, slow and low, beginning to fill the spaces between the hills. By evening, it would cover everything. The road, the river, the house, the collection room I had unlocked last week and left open so the morning light could reach June's catalog cards again. I had hung a small wooden sign above the door. I carved it myself from a piece of Douglas fir left over from the shelves I built in 1993. It read, "June's room," 2 words, block letters. The kind of letters she said looked like a man building a fence, 1 post at a time. I sanded it smooth and sealed it with marine varnish, the same varnish I used on the lighthouse windows when the salt air turned them cloudy. It would last. Some things, if you build them right, do last. When I got home, I walked to the porch and stood where I always stand, facing the river, the fog settling around me like a coat I had worn so many times it no longer felt like weather. Below the hill, the Columbia moved west toward the bar, toward the open Pacific, toward the place where the river stops being a river and becomes something larger than any name we give it. The lighthouse at Cape Disappointment was turning, its beams sweeping across the water in intervals. I had counted 10,000 times. 4 seconds of light, 4 seconds of dark, 4 seconds of light. I opened the logbook. I wrote the date. I wrote the weather. Then, beneath the weather, I wrote one line that was not about the sky or the wind or the visibility. The light is still running. I closed the book and went inside.